Hi, welcome to Changemakers, a smarter school podcast exploring how to live a successful and happy life. I am Kathrada, your host. On every episode, I talk to great thinkers and doers from different walks of life who are at the forefront of positively impacting society. Our conversations focus on their specific journeys to achieving their goals. We talk mindsets, books, advice, and tools they use to keep them motivated. All the key ingredients you need for a happy and fulfilling life. I hope you enjoy this next episode. Hello, Dr. Shakira Choonara. How are you?
Good afternoon, Katlego. I can't complain. I guess the word that I've been using during these times is I'm surviving. What about you?
I think I'm more than surviving at the current moment, thriving. So, thank you firstly for making time to join us on the Smarty School podcast. We appreciate it.
Only a pleasure, and I like the whole title, Smart is Cool. Pretty cool, if I can say that.
Yeah, we only bring on the smart people and cool people like yourself to learn more, about what you do and to keep us inspired or motivated. So without further ado, if I were to read an entire list of the honors or awards that you have, I think it will take the entire 30 minutes of this show. Could you just, introduce yourself in terms of your upbringing, where you come from, and where did you go to study and what you're doing currently?
Mhm. So, Katlego, I mean, thank you. It always it's this bittersweet moment whenever people mention my accolades because it sort of makes you feel very conscious, very lucky, very fortunate. But when I introduce myself, and I think of myself as a very humble person because that's the sort of family I was brought up into. And we've never used our accolades or anything like that to sort of hold influence. And I think that going back in terms of who I am and how I usually introduce myself, I always start off because I think a big part of my life and my dreams and my passion is centered around healthcare. And that makes up a huge chunk of who I am as a public health practitioner. But outside of that healthcare realm, what else and who else am I? I like to identify myself as a proud South African, but I think I'm more African than South African. Uh, Outside of all of that, I'm very passionate about fighting against racism. Being from South Africa, seeing and experiencing injustice, and aside from all of that, something that the pandemic disrupted was me pursuing acting classes. I thoroughly enjoy that, and I'll end up saying that. One of my other hobbies is to travel extensively and looking back, not just on honors, but looking back on my 20s. I spent such a large chunk of my life traveling and living life and thriving. And I've just recently launched an Instagram channel around the brand I was creating known as Travel Guru.
Wow. Thank you for that response. And I think it really ties up to where I want our conversation to focus. A lot of young people, even older people, would actually jump on those accolades, and make those things, be the most important thing that defines them, because obviously linked to that, there's a sort of, privileges that you can get, by having achieved things like that. So we have a lot of people who claim to be leaders, but are not there, to influence and change the lives of others, but that's just my assessment, but rather are there to serve themselves. What's your take on that?
I also have dreams and interests and aspirations, and we have to admit that. But I think it goes back again to who you are and what you want to do. And some people in life, for example, want to make money and get rich and be famous, and that's fine. It's acceptable. And others, for example, want to serve humanity, and I consider myself to fit into the latter category. So for me, it's not so much about who I am in society, but it's rather what I do and what I stand for. And I think it stems from two people that I think of immediately in my life. And I always speak about my father because he played a central role in how I address the workplace and the sort of person that I am. My father was a hugely brilliant individual, very quiet and very humble. And I think, I grew up learning a lot from him and his moral compass. He also had this immense honesty in the way that he did things. And then later on, I was very lucky to be mentored by the late Ahmed Kathrada, who spent 26 years on Robben Island. And the one thing that struck me, I mean, I joined the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation in my 20s, about 21 or so. And you would expect that someone like Ahmed Kathrada would walk into a room and command attention and sort of boss people around and, have that celebrity status
Yeah.
that we see in so many so-called leaders in our spaces. But, till today, when I reflect on Uncle Kathy, he was very similar to my father in the sense that he'd walk into a room, nobody would even know who he was, and he wouldn't make a point of saying, I am Ahmed Kathrada. And it was just this sense of extreme humility, not commanding any attention, not wanting attention, but serving selflessly, not enriching himself. I remember the director of the foundation saying that Ahmed Kathrada, for example, would wear suits from Edgar's, so not Armani suits. He would fly economy class. He would drive a Toyota. And I think all of that speaks to, do you want material gain or do you want the gain of the soul and the gain of giving back? And I think I've gone around in a circle to answer you, but I hope that I've given you some thoughts around, what is it that we sort of aspire to be and what sort of characters and moral compass does one have? And I think that's important, not the who you are or the place you hold in society.
Yeah. I like that response, but I want to, I think, in our society today with, being crazy, obsessed, like you said, with material gains and, a flashy lifestyle, the Instagram lifestyle, so to call it. Don't you feel like you are a bit unpopular maybe in and around your circle? Has there been any challenges, or do you feel as if you are swimming against the tide, by having that sort of philosophy of life?
I think I feel comfortable with who I am. I don't have an issue with it. And I think part of it comes from having a very humble beginning. We struggled growing up. And now when I sort of have things, I look back and I don't regret the childhood that I had and the upbringing that I had because it taught me what the little things are that you need to appreciate.
Hmm.
And even today, I don't look for material gains. So, for example, people would think I'm hugely wealthy, but what you find is I tend to do projects and work that are impactful and soul filling. I don't necessarily follow the dollar signs. And I think, it's not so much swimming against the tide, but it's about staying true to who you are. And I think that's something that's very important to me. I also find that living humbly, it keeps me grounded. It reminds me of my parents, it reminds me of my family, it reminds me of where I'm from. Because I think what also tends to happen in life is those of us who are able to break out of the poverty cycle, tend to want to follow more material gains, tend to want more, bigger houses, better cars, all of that. And eventually we
Mm.
forget where we came from. And I think that's what leads to corruption. I think that's what leads to the corruption of oneself and of society because you eventually so delinked from that background and where you came from and where you need to go back to be able to change.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, I feel that. And I want you to maybe expand a bit more on what you just said now. looking more into like the workspace and being part of certain leadership forums, like you've been, in the Youth Council of the African Union, for instance, and other positions that you've held, having that sort of mindset, have you felt like maybe other leaders, in similar positions or higher, did not share the same vision? Did they have a different way of looking at things and using the positions of power that they had? Can you expand a bit more on that?
So, Katlego, I actually penned a poem during my time in the African Union, and it was something along the lines that whether you're old or whether you're young, you still have the ability to be corrupt. And we shouldn't kid ourselves that just saying throwing young people into spaces is the solution. Because what we see is, for example, the African
Mm,
National Congress has young people, the Democratic Alliance has young people, all political parties have young people. But are these young people the young people that we need to take the country forward? Or are they there enriching themselves and looking for positions? And I think that's a fundamental question we've got to reflect on. And so this poem is really about my time in the African Union and what I had seen. And essentially, it was about how power corrupts. And when one
mm,
is in a position of power, I remember young, and I won't quote, but there were young people of influence in the African Union who said to us, be quiet and play the politics.
mm,
We
mm,
need to play the politics to get ahead. And for me, hearing that at some of my very first meetings, I felt uncomfortable. I sort of, gave it time and wanted to see where this goes. But what I had witnessed and observed, Katlego, and it's not just in the African Union, I think it's in the development space as well, is that people
mhm.
are unfortunately there to line their pockets.
Yeah,
And we all have bills to pay, so I'm not going to act like I'm a saint.
sure.
But I think that we shouldn't go beyond what we need, And so there's this competitive nature, there's this let's put each other down nature that happens, and it happens among young people as well. Long story short, I think that it's in our times at least, it's very easy to create an online presence and look as if you're doing things.
Mhm.
But at the heart of it and behind the scenes, you're breaking other young people down. You are corrupt. You're not accounting for the funds. And
Sheesh.
so to go back to your initial question, Katlego, is that to be honest, I find that it's very difficult and it's very rare to find people who resonate with me. But that being said, there are people. So even in the African Union, a 10-member council, my colleague Simon from South Sudan, who's a refugee and now living in Uganda, the two of us got on like a house on fire, and we still do, because we hold
Mhm.
these moral ideas, these ethical ideas. But these are very rare on the continent and even in the workplace. So, for example, even in the workplace, you would find that even in instances of racism, people are quiet either because they're worried about their own position and their own career progression and they don't
Mm,
speak up. And I'm one of those people that, unfortunately, even if I try and just hang on and be quiet and go with the flow, there will come a point where I can't. And I think for me, that's great because it teaches,
mhm.
or it goes back to a test for me. And especially looking at my time in the African Union, I could have used this position of power to show the world that I'm great. But instead, I spoke the truth and I said that this was a meaningless position. I held the title, but there was no action, there was no concrete anything within the AU. And so I think it also goes back to who you are as a person and what you stand for. And it goes back to that earlier question that you asked me. Are there many of us? And I think, unfortunately, there are very few. But what gives me hope is how these few and these rare sort of gems in leadership can come together to shape things. And that for me was the Mandela generation, the Kathrada generation, the Lillian Ngoyi and Albertina Sisulu, those leaders who were able to craft a vision and do so for the country, not for themselves.
Well, I mean, hearing you say that, I'm thinking obviously this does not only happen in the developmental space or in the political spaces, but happens even in corporate, where someone is working for a corporate giant, but there might be issues of racial exclusion or some stereotypical way of mistreating people because of their sexual orientation or because of their gender, etc. And I think that there are people who want to do good, but maybe the systems and institutions don't allow for it. It's not easy to speak up. And like you said, you have people who are saying you have to play politics if you want to move ahead. It's easy to go with the status quo instead of against. And this ties up with that earlier question about swimming against the tide. So how do you make sure that you remain true to yourself and in the process you still develop as a professional? Because I don't know about you, or are you okay with, like, okay, no one wants to hire me, I'll speak my truth? How do you, or how do others, maybe not just you, what would be your advice to say how should people maneuver those sort of situations and environments to make sure that they can still speak up, you know um, but they still remain sort of safe, for a lack of a better word, in terms of their career progression or being part of a certain organization. What's your take on that?
You see, that's where the true test of who one is as a leader, and I think that's the definition of leadership. Because we throw around terms, and I mean, Katlego, you know this. You've been at school in South Africa as well. So you throw around terms around leadership, being brave, being courageous, sacrificing.
Mm-hmm.
And then you sort of realize, and I realize, especially with my time in the African Union, but in different institutions, even in the university space as well, when I spoke up there, is you have things to lose. What do you have to lose? You have your career to lose, and you have income to lose. And to be honest, I was also afraid of losing income. And I mentioned that I'm from humble beginnings, so it's not like I have a big trust fund to fall back on.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so it's a risk. And I think that's when you sort of, you realize what sort of person you're and what sort of leader you are. Because if you're a real leader, then you're an activist, essentially, because you're willing to be brave, you're willing to be courageous, you're willing to take the path and say things that no one wants to say and do, but you do so because it's right. And so, yes, the systems are strong, they're established, they've been there for a very long time. You get big scale action, such as Greta Thunberg, such a fan of her, but you also get small scale action. And I think that I'm probably a small scale action sort of person. And when I talk about that, it's about whichever space you're in, whether you're in your community, whether you're in the workplace, whether you're in a social gathering where people are racist. It's about how do you stand up and how do you say the right thing? How do you go against the tide? And that's true leadership. And for me, if no matter how difficult it is, if you're not going against the tide, you are then sacrificing your principles and you're no longer a leader, I think. That's just, my 2 cents worth, of course. And I can give you one example in the development space. There's this largest gathering of women and girls. It's known as Women Deliver. And last year, there were a couple of staff members who claimed or who shared their experiences of racism. And in that Women Deliver network, Katlego, there's about, 5,000-6,000 young leaders already in there. But for me, it was so surprising that these 5,000 or 6,000 young leaders, the majority from low and middle income countries who experience racism, not one or two of them spoke out in support of these staff members.
Mm-hmm.
The donors in the international space just turned a blind eye. This is a big, huge organization with claims of racism, and everybody was going ahead as normal. So it also makes me think about some of these staff members. They were going up against a huge organization, financially strong, powerfully strong, but they stood up. And that's small scale action. And the moral of the story is that they weren't the Greta Thunbergs who made world news, but they started to chip away at what's wrong in institutions. And with that small little change that they did, I'm able to tell you this story.
Yeah.
And they let their careers go, their financing go, and they stood up and they spoke out. So I think for me, that's the essence of leadership.
Phew. So all in all, essentially, we have to be comfortable with losing at first. Sacrificing and losing something that we value. I hear you. I want you to now, take it back, come back home a bit. We've recently had the protests and looting of shops, and we know that we have a big problem with youth unemployment. And for most people who've assessed the situation have said that the current crop of leaders have failed us as young people. That we find ourselves where we are today. And I want your take in terms of what the solutions are. And not necessarily diagnose what the problems are. But what can we do going forward as normal young people in our own spaces, to move our country forward and to deal with all the social ills that we have.
So, Katewa, I'm going to have some strong opinions on this. So, I don't know if it's parental guidance to you and your listeners. And I am going to diagnose the problem a little bit because I
That's
think
fine.
that when I reflect on what's happened in South Africa, it didn't start now. It started when different institutions were pushing motions of no confidence in the president or the former president. From the time he had allegations of rape, people were sweeping it under the carpet. The very people who are speaking out in the ANC against Zuma now, when they had the chance to remove him, they did not. The very young leaders that are punted as young leaders for fees must fall and idolized for fees must fall were fighting for fees must fall, but were not fighting against corruption. They were fighting for fees must fall, and 2 weeks later sitting in a stadium at the ANC rally supporting Zuma. So I want to start there because I think that's where the solution is. The solution is, one, we've got to be proactive wherever we are. We've got to speak the truth. And I don't think you're going to find many people like me who are going to say so, that, there were so many chances to get rid of the former president. We are now where we are because of people in the ANC who put the party above the country. And I think that's a mistake. And that goes back to, are you putting your positions and your power ahead of society? And so I think that's the first problem, but it's also the solution. How do you start to put society above all else, not your political alliance? The second issue is that of youth. I think that there are a crop of young leaders in this country, and Kateho, you're part of this genre, but we're all sitting outside the political space. Why and how do we get into this political space and push change, but not get lost in the process while we do this? I think there's immense power in all of us in this country coming together. I just don't know how, and I don't know where, because the ANC has such a stronghold. The third area I would say is that, and I'm sorry for being so critical of the fees must fall leaders, but if young people could bring this country to a standstill for education, the heart of all of our issues in this country and on this continent is corruption. When will young people mobilize on this continent for corruption? And there are too few of us that want to go this path and this route. So those are just, I don't know how we'll implement this and who will implement this. And hopefully I can also play a role. I try to through my words and my interactions. But how do we do this? And I think those are three top things which come to mind.
Sure. Yeah, that's a lot to to digest and try to understand. But I think you make very good points. I don't want to pick any one of them and say let's follow up on them. But I think when it comes to the first one about a certain individual or a former president, there might be different views of it's not just an individual, but the problem was probably more wider than one person. But that's maybe a topic for another day. Um, after listening to you and talking about your father and being part of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, and that what can I go? You had people who gave you a good example practically in front of you, to be the person that you are and to think the way that you think, today. Most of us, don't have maybe those sort of figures, that close. So how do you think that practically, as a society, we can reshape, you know, most of us, most of the people to be less materialistic, to be more into, servant leadership. How do we do that as a society on a broader scale?
That's a tough one because this is, and I don't want to go there, but I'm going to have to go there. And I don't want to use jargon either, but I'll have to. This is linked Katleho, to the capitalist system. And the capitalist system, I'm not saying that we should do away with the capitalist system, but at the heart of capitalism and the way it feeds into the way institutions work and the economy works, but also the way we taught at a young age by those around us, our teachers, our peers, what we see on television, for example, is that, go to school, work hard, get a job, get money, be successful.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not what we should be teaching our young people. And I think there's a little bit of internalization in the homes, in our spaces, in the conversations we have, and it can start informally, I think. So you having this podcast, one sort of mechanism, but how do we start to reach more young people? Because I think it's going to be the turning point is how you're able to shape the youth. And if the youth are taught that money equals success, then I don't know how we're going to break that cycle. Because even then, when they get into the workplace, that's what people are chasing. I think it's about teaching people what are the things we can change in our community. What are the things we can change in the world? How do we enable young people to be able to do that? And when I reflect at Leho, I think informally I had these lessons, but it's only when I really reached my 20s. Because, if you don't go to a private school in South Africa, you don't have these extracurricular activities and mentorship and all of these sorts of things. You're sort of introduced to it at university level. And so I think it's about starting all of that a lot earlier and building it into the education system. So even for example, having peer mentors is going to be essential. Or having ordinary South Africans, giving time to young people, especially in their teenage years, to start to mentor and provide that sort of guidance and those sort of leadership examples is going to be critical. That's just one answer. I mean, I don't have the answer for everything everywhere. But what I think it also then goes back to is individual responsibility. That mirror, when you look into yourself, when no one's watching, that saying that doing the right thing when no one's watching, when you're not posting it on social media and all of that, it's that individual that we've got to become. And I think that's the other key area. How we get there, I'm not quite sure, and I don't know. It's a big, huge system to unravel.
Well, on that note, I think we should maybe close with one of your favorite quotes, or you know, maybe one of the wisest advice you've received, because I feel like you have a lot of knowledge and wisdom to share. But I don't want to, hog you on this platform. I know that you have other responsibilities and things to get to.
Never ever. I'm so lucky that you're having me on this spot. Is cool. So don't worry about it. But I think, as I close, I don't have. There's a couple of formal quotes, but there's a couple of informal quotes as well.
Mm,
And I think
mm,
that I'll share all of them because I want the listeners to sort of reflect and be inspired. And so my dad, I go back to my dad because he's just been this rock in my life. And I remember I got this really huge project
mm.
where I had to write something on behalf of the Director General of the World Health Organization. And I
Wow.
stressed and I didn't know how to start and I didn't know how to do it. And my dad said to me, just do what you know because you're really smart and you know how to do this. And I've just sort of kept those words with me because I just did that. I'm like, forget everything, Shakira, write this the way you're supposed to write this. And the response was, Shakira, you are so brilliant. And I just laughed. The other advice my dad gave me was when I was bungee jumping. And I think it's about that risk that you take in life and that blood rush you sort of get. And so he said, when you get to that point to bungee jump, and he's never bungee jumped, but he still gave me that advice. He said, don't think about it, just jump. And it's true, I was standing at the Soweto Towers, and the minute you start thinking about it, you're starting to think, okay, I'm going to die. Oh my God, it's it's
Yeah,
such a
yeah.
long way down. And then I remembered his words, just jump, and I just jumped and screamed, and that was it. If I think, if you'd allow me, Kate, well, I'll share one or two other
No,
things.
yeah,
I
go
think
ahead, please. Yeah.
one of my favorite quotes comes from Uncle Kathy, or Ahmed Kathrada, but we called him Uncle Kathy.
Mm,
And it's in his book Memoirs, I think, or one of his books, anyways. And it says that the hardest thing to open is a closed mind.
mm,
And I think that's very powerful. And then he also talks a little bit about Robben Island. And I want to talk about that because it goes back to your earlier question of how do we keep ourselves grounded? How do we know that leadership equals sacrifice? And in his book Memoirs, he talks about Robben Island being cold showers, cold food, cold all round. And in those two or three words, he's talking about 26 years of feeling cold in every sense of the word and the sacrifice that
mm,
he had. I think, one of my final pieces of advice, and it's not so much a quote, but I think that I've had incredible mentors in the workplace, such as Professor John Isles, who retired, Vicky Tellis, who I worked with, and now Vilashni Govender as well. And there's one thing I've learned from them is approach life positively. Be supportive to those around you. Don't bring anyone down. Be supportive. And the final thing was have faith in yourself.
mm.
And, whenever I got these accolades, I never believed I would actually get them. And when I look back on it, I say that one of my biggest shortfalls or pitfalls is that I also struggle to believe in myself. And I think that these mentors have unleashed that power. So I can go on forever, and I've told you
Mm.
a whole bunch of things,
Yeah,
but I hope
yeah,
your listeners find some laughs and inspiration.
yeah. That is certainly was very rich and wise. That even things that we might consider simple could be so significant. In someone's life. Thank you very much, Shakira, for your time today. I appreciate it. I've
I
learned
should
quite a
thank
lot
you.
from you, and I'm more inspired and more hopeful about our country and our continent. If we can just multiply people who have a similar perspective as you do, I think there's definitely hope.
Thank you, Katlego, and I can't wait to take you bungee jumping at some point.
I'll see if I will jump. Oh my god. Thanks. Yeah, we should do it soon.
For sure. Thanks, A.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. This has been a Smarty School production. Catch you on the next episode. Stay smart and keep well. If you enjoyed this episode of Changemakers, please subscribe if you have not already. Help us spread the word by rating and commenting on the podcast. We like hearing from you, as this will help us create better content and reach more people. Share this episode with your friends, family, and colleagues whom you think will benefit or like this sort of content. If you have questions for me or my guest, or topics that you would like us to discuss next time, email me at podcasts@smartyschool.co.za.